Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the Dominicans, particularly Brother Connor, and wish him happy birthday. Today's his birthday. I'm glad to be here in St. Catherine's Chapel. St. Catherine is one of the two patron saints of Italy with St. Francis of Assisi. So we'll begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, and enlighten our hearts and our minds, so that we can learn from the life and the writings of Blessed John Henry Newman. St. Catherine, pray for us. So you might be familiar with John Henry Newman. I'll give you a very short summary of his life, and then we will see why he came to Dublin and what he did in Dublin and what he said about the university. So Newman was born in London in 1801, and he spent half of his life in Oxford. He studied in Oxford, and then he was ordained a vicar, a priest in the Church of England. And he was the vicar of St. Mary's in Oxford, which is the university parish. When he was in Oxford, he spent most of his life studying theology, writing particularly on the early centuries, on the Greek fathers. And he was a famous preacher. He was a member of the so-called Oxford movement, which was a movement within the Church of England, a movement of rediscovery of the sources, the roots of the Church. Now, in this period of Newman's life, Newman was defending the idea that the Church of England was a so-called via media, a way in between two excesses, the excesses of Catholicism on one side and the excesses of Protestantism on the other side. But with time, particularly with the study of the early centuries, Newman realized that since the beginning there's always been divisions among the Christians, but there's always been one Catholic Church and then churches on the side. So at a certain point he had to decide himself what side he should be on, and he left Oxford because at that time there was no place for non-Church of England men in Oxford, and after a while he was accepted in the Catholic Church. So then he became a Catholic priest. He was reordained, and he studied theology in Rome, even if he was a distinguished theologian. He spent some years here in Dublin, but I'm going to talk about this later. And he spent the second half of his life in Birmingham, where he founded the oratory. He joined the Order of the Oratorians, the order founded by Philip Neri, an Italian founder. And so he spent most of his time in Birmingham working with the poor and with the faithful of Birmingham. And only later in his life he was made Cardinal. It was almost 78, 79. He had some problems with the church after his conversion, but eventually Pope Leo XIII, which is quite important for the Dominicans, for his promotion of the study of St. Thomas. So Leo XIII made him a cardinal, and now we know that he's blessed and hopefully will be a saint and maybe a doctor of the church. Now, why Newman came to Dublin and what has Newman has to say about the university? At the beginning of the 19th century, in Dublin there was only one college and one university, University of Dublin, and the only constituent college was Trinity College, Dublin. Now, since the statutes of Charles I, 1637, Catholics had been excluded from being members of the college. But then, with the Catholic Relief Act of 1793, the English Parliament abolished the religious tests to enter the college. So Catholic could enter the college, but they couldn't they couldn't become fellow, or they couldn't become lecturer or professors. So in 1845, there was a project proposed by the English government to establish some new colleges for Catholics, for non-Church of England students, open to any denomination in Ireland. And these three colleges, which eventually will be called the Queen's Colleges, were going to be in Belfast, Cork, and Galway or Limerick. Eventually was in Galway. The Catholic bishops had different opinions on this proposal. The majority of the bishops were against this proposal, but funny enough, the Bishop of Dublin and the Bishop of Armagh, the Primate of all Ireland, they tended to be in favour of this, the establishment of these new colleges. But bishops couldn't find an agreement between them, and they looked for an opinion from Rome, from Propaganda Fide. And Propaganda decided that the proposed colleges could be dangerous for the faith of the students. So they suggested to establish a Catholic college. Now, as I said before, the Bishop of Armagh wasn't too happy with this idea, but he died, and his name was Crawley, and he was substituted by an important man in this story, by Paul Cullen. Paul Cullen was the most important Irishman in Rome at the time. He spent most of his early life in Rome as a student and then as the rector of the Irish College there. And Paul Cullen was the Irishman in Rome, in the Vatican. And when Newman was in Rome, Paul Cullen had acted as an external examiner of Newman's theological thesis. So they knew each other, they were in good relationship. And Cullen was chosen to be the new Archbishop of Armagh. He became Primate of all Ireland. And after a few years, in 1852, when the Bishop of Dublin died, Dr. Murray, Cullen became the Bishop of Dublin. So it was moved from Armagh to Dublin. This is quite important because we often talk about Newman's University and the Catholic University as an enterprise promoted by Newman. But Paul Cullen had a very important role in the establishment of this university. Now, unfortunately, there were divisions among the bishops, and some of them perceived this as a project promoted by Cullen, but rather by the whole hierarchy. And this is one of the reasons why eventually this project didn't really work. We need to remember that we are talking about the 1850s, so this is the period just after the Great Famine. Ireland had suffered probably the worst tragedy in its life. So Ireland was quite poor, and Newman had never been to Ireland before he was invited by Cullen in 1851 to give a few lectures on the university education. So he came to Ireland, he visited different dioceses, he proposed a project on what this new university should be like, and then he gave five lectures in the Rotunda, not far from here. These 5 lectures are part of the first section of the idea of a university. The idea of a university is probably considered the greatest classic on university education, not only on Catholic university education, but education in general. So Newman gave these lectures, and this was a very difficult period for Newman. And the cause for this distress was a Dominican, or better was a former Dominican, an Italian one called Giacinto Achilli. Now, he was a former Dominican in the sense that they had left the order, he also left the church, and he had become a Protestant. He was traveling around England, and with the help of the Evangelical Alliance, he was preaching against the Catholic faith. Now, Newman had attacked Achille in one of his talks, and Achille was famous for being immoral, let's say. So Newman had publicly attacked him, and Achille brought a criminal action for libel against Newman, and Newman was required to provide evidence for his allegations. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to provide evidence in the sense that the women that were molested by Achille were in Italy. It was difficult to go to Italy to find testimonies and so on. And this is exactly, this process went on exactly in the 1852-53 when Newman was in Ireland promoting the Catholic University, when actually he wrote the first part of the idea of a university. So in this same period, Newman thought, and not only Newman, but Cullen, they all thought that Newman was going to be put in jail. Eventually, he was found guilty, but he was only fined. But it shows, we need to remember that there was a very difficult period in Newman's life. Anyway, so why is Newman so important for his idea of the university? Well, I forgot to say that the university was eventually opened in 1854, and the initial plan was to have the traditional four faculties, which are medicine, law, theology, and arts. And then Newman wanted a fifth faculty of science. Now, the first faculty that was open was arts, and it eventually was the only one that really worked, together with the School of Medicine. The School of Medicine was opened two years later. Now, since the beginning, since arts was founded, there were not so many students, and we can understand why. Again, it was a difficult period for Ireland. The Catholic middle class was not big enough to feed a university. Anyway, Newman opened the university with 17 students and 6 professors and 9 lecturers. Six of them were coming from England. They were English, they were converts. And this was another difficulty that Newman had here in Ireland, because English converts, or better, English people were generally seen with suspect. One of the controversies between Newman and some of the bishops was the involvement of English lecturers here in Dublin. So the university was open, but Newman was still the head of the Birmingham Oratory, so he kept moving from Birmingham to Dublin and vice versa. So he couldn't devote himself completely to this project here in Ireland. He eventually resigned as a rector in 1858. So he was the head of this new Catholic University of Ireland for 8 years. And since then, he never came back to Ireland. And I'm going to say something more about why the university failed towards the end of my talk. But what is more important is not so much the real university that Newman founded, but what he says about the university. Now, we need to remember that Newman talks about a university in general, about a Catholic university, and about the Catholic university in Ireland. So sometimes when we read his writings, we might find contradictions or inconsistencies, but we need to distinguish if it's, again, is speaking of a university or a Catholic university or a Catholic university in Ireland. So, you have a few quotes. They are all from the idea of a university, apart from the last two. The last two are taken from one of the sermons that he preached in University Church in St. Stephen's Green. So if you want to understand Newman's ideas on the university, firstly we need to know is a general theory of knowledge and theory of education. Newman says that there's a unity in the universe. This comes from the fact that the whole reality is a product of the creation of God. But our mind doesn't grasp reality as a unity of reality. We don't grasp everything at once. So our mind is, in some sense, the origin of fragmentation. So we need to learn, we need to inquire from different perspectives. And these different perspectives are the different sciences. And it's only through different perspectives that we can grasp what is real. So our mind is at the same time the origin of fragmentation, but also what permits this unification. And Newman thinks that the idea of a unity is what has been lost in contemporary philosophy, and therefore it's been lost in contemporary education. Now, if you read the first passage that I have selected, he says, "The majestic vision of the Middle Ages, which grew steadily to perfection in the course of centuries, the University of Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, has almost gone out at night, in night. A philosophical comprehensiveness, an orderly expansiveness, an elastic constructiveness. Men have lost them. I cannot make out why. This is why. Because they've lost the idea of a unity." So they've lost the idea of a unity, and therefore university itself has lost its meaning or its reason to be. Now we need to remember that the topics that Newman discusses in his writings on the university discusses almost everywhere in the rest of Europe. You will find similar writings in Germany, in the writings of von Humboldt, or in France, by Renan, or in Italy by Rosmini or Labriola. They are all discussing how the new sciences and how the new disciplines could match with traditional teaching in the university. At the same time, we see the emerging classes, especially the middle class, who want to be involved more and more in the decision process. And education was essential in order to enter into the decision process. So we see that almost everywhere there's been a refoundation of universities in the 19th century, especially in the first half of the 19th century, almost everywhere in Europe. And in the English-speaking language, Newman is the best example of this discussion on the university. But similar discussions were going on the popular press and also on educated magazines. And when Newman talks about education, he's always replying to his own contemporaries, but also to some of the philosophers that inspired the discussion of the time, and I'm going to mention them in a moment. So let's go back to the idea of a unity. Unity is what has been lost in modern times, and without unity, without the sense of unity, Newman says every science tends to think that that's the only possible explanation, and that's the only possible understanding of what's reality, what's the world. So Newman stresses the fact that there must be a place where all sciences gather, even physically gather, and confront. And there must be a place where the student is introduced to different disciplines, and the student learns how to take the best from them and how to confront to any possible area of study, any area of research. In the first part of the idea in university, Newman stresses the fact that even if one science is taken off from the curriculum, every other field of knowledge will suffer, and particularly if theology is out of the curriculum, the study of human beings will suffer. But we're not going to spend too much time on theology. So he says that when one of the limits of intellectual inquiry is that everybody tends to overestimate the importance of their own discipline, and this brings to one side to partiality, in the sense that considering our own discipline as unique and complete, we forget that there's more and we can learn from more. And another limitation of this attitude is what he calls the unjustified enlargement. So we think that our method, the method used in a discipline, is the only possible method. And this is dangerous, and this is particularly dangerous in the study of human beings. So Newman says we can study human beings from a physical point of view, from the point of view of economics, from the point of view of history, from the point of view of theology, philosophy, and from the point of view of revelation. Now, these are all valid, but once you take some of them off, you won't have the complete framework, and you will miss something. In the second quotes, he says, "The drift and meaning of a branch of knowledge varies with the company in which it is introduced to student. If his reading is confined simply to one subject, however such division of labor may favor the advancement of a particular pursuit, certainly it has a tendency to contract his mind. If it is incorporated with others, it depends on those others as to the kind of influence which it exerts upon him." Yeah, somewhere else Newman says that we cannot do without a view. Our mind tends to have a view. It's a natural drive. We always try to have an opinion, have a view. And when we cannot get the truth, we create our own truth, and that's one of the possible mistakes that we can have in an intellectual inquiry. So we can only improve and correct this when we confront what we know, what other people know. And the university is one of the places. This is probably the place where this should happen. But what is particularly interesting for me, I think, is that Newman more than once stressed the fact that what has been said about the university, it is true also in modern times. It's true for what he says calls the metropolis or the cities, and this has never been noticed by scholars. I might read one or two quotes. He said that in the past the university was the place where the library was collected, the books were collected. Maybe there were also collections of other items in the museum. It was a place where the educated people would gather and discuss and so on. And this is, in modern times, Newman says, this is more or less what happened in any big city. And if Newman was alive today, he would say, you don't even need to live in a city, you just need a computer and the internet to have access to an incredible amount of resources. So in some sense, what Newman says about the university is not just about the university, it's about study in general, or it's about, again, research and intellectual inquiry. Let me see if I find, yeah. For instance, he says, the very same kinds of need, social and moral, which give rise to a metropolis, give rise also to a university. Nay, that every metropolis is a university. So every metropolis is a university, as far as the rudiments of a university are concerned. So I think that when we read his writing on the university, we should try to extend this to any possible virtual university. This is another expression he uses, the metropolis as a virtual university. So So what do we do in a university? Well, we study, and we study some discipline. We can't study everything. But even when we study one subject, one discipline, Newman says that we can have different attitudes. We can study for different reasons, different purposes. For instance, he says, you can study theology in order to contemplate the truth about God, or you can study theology because you need to teach the catechism. One is an instrumental, the second is an instrumental attitude. The first is a study for the sake of itself. And this is probably his most important teaching in his writings on the university. So what is the aim of knowledge? Newman says the purpose of knowledge, or the purpose of what he calls liberal knowledge, is knowledge itself. So knowledge is an end in itself. What does it mean? It means that it's a reward for human mind. Before being used for other purposes, knowledge, as long as it is the contemplation of truth, has a value in itself. It's not merely a mean for something else, it's a reward. And first of all, it has to be promoted for its own sake. Now, he doesn't deny that there are other purposes for the study, and there are what he calls the secondary ends. But he says the primary ends, of study is study itself. And he calls this attitude the liberal knowledge, the liberal, not in any political or ideological sense. So when he talks about liberalism, or better, liberal knowledge, it doesn't refer to political liberalism. There's no political connotation or liberal theology. Actually, at the end of his life, when he received the cardinalate, when he became cardinal, in his famous speech, he says that he spent all of his life fighting theological liberalism. So again, liberal here as a meaning of related to what liberal arts, what liberal study meant, especially in ancient times. Liberal comes from, as you know, from liber, which is the free man, the man who is not a slave. And Newman quotes extensively from Cicero. He makes reference to Cicero and Aristotle in particular when he talks about liberal education. Liberal education is that form of education that has no other purpose than itself. So Newman said, in ancient times, the gymnastic was a liberal art, and medicine was a servile art. The slaves would study medicine because they had to use their knowledge. But the free man didn't need to study for a practical purpose. So even music or gymnastic is a more noble art than medicine in his conception. So what's liberal knowledge? Again, it's more an attitude. So you can study anything and have a liberal attitude and study as a form of liberal knowledge. He says while useful knowledge reserves itself into a tangible fruit, liberal knowledge is just good for the mind. And when I was reading those pages, I was thinking, nowadays this is exactly what is needed and what actually companies look for. If you work for Google, they don't really care what's your background. They want an open mind because technology goes so fast that you can't be ready. But they need somebody with a mind, with an open mind, and a mind that is able to adequate to every possible new development. But Newman was thinking, when Newman talks about liberal knowledge, he was thinking of a tendency, a trend in the discussion of his times. A trend promoted by so-called utilitarians. Now, the utilitarians were inspired by the English philosopher John Locke, who lived a couple of centuries before Newman. And Newman attacks Locke in his writings, but it also attacks Locke's followers in Newman's time. And Locke, in his writing, shows that if there is a cost, if there is a price for knowledge, there also must be a return for society. If society spends time and resources on teaching, what's the return? So there must be a practical return, and usefulness has to be the measure for intellectual labor. Now, this is the opposite view compared to what Newman says, and you can imagine that you can organize a school or a university inspired by a principle of utilitarianism or a principle of liberal arts. So Locke was the main inspiration for a group of writers, contributors to the Edinburgh Review. The Edinburgh Review was a quite influential review, and during the discussion on the new curriculum, what has to be included, what was the role of this new subject, the writers of the Edinburgh Review were inspired by Locke, and they were trying to expand Locke's view on political, social policies. Newman replies to Locke and to his followers saying that the useful is not always good, but the good is always useful. And he's talking not only about the moral good, but mostly about the intellectual good. So a good mind is also useful, but usefulness in itself is not always good. And he established a parallel between bodily and intellectual health. So this is, I'm going to read from quotation number 6. He says, "If a liberal education consists in the culture of the intellect, and if that culture be in itself a good, here, without going further, is an answer to Locke's question. For if a healthy body is a good in itself, why is not a healthy intellect? And if a college of physicians is a useful institution because it contemplates bodily health, why not an academic body? Though you were simply and solely engaged in imparting vigor and beauty and grasp to the intellectual portion of our nature." So the utilitarians were judging the actions and the decision made in terms of consequences. So if an action had good consequences, well, it's a good action. Newman says before looking at the consequence, we need to see what kind of human beings we have in our mind, what kind of beings we want when we need to decide what has to be studied. And in some sense it is paradoxical that the only section, the only part of Newman's university that really worked was the medical school. And the only reason why the medical school worked when the rest of the Catholic University didn't really work is because in Newman's times you didn't need a degree to be a doctor, but you need to pass examinations. So the medical school was preparing students for the examination, and even if the degrees of the Catholic University of Ireland were never recognized by the state, because the state, the English state, didn't want to provide a charter, a legal recognition to those degrees, but those students were prepared to pass some external examination. So it's kind of paradoxical that the professional part of Newman's university is the only one that survived. But in my book, I claim that the whole set of Newman writings is paradoxical. These ideas are paradoxical because they are necessary without being possible in our society. It's probably impossible to have a college completely inspired by Newman's vision, and at the same time it's what we need. That's why it's paradoxical. think I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes. Is that right? So, this is what the university is about. The university is about the cultivation of the intellect. And Newman says, even if, actually he says in quotation number 7, so he says, a university taking its bare idea before we view it as an instrument of the church as this object and its mission. It contemplates neither moral impression nor mechanical production. It professes to exercise the mind neither in art or in duty. Its function is intellectual culture, and here he might leave its scholar, and he has done its work when it's done as much as this. So in his writings, Newman clearly distinguishes knowledge from utility, but also distinguishes knowledge from morality. That's an important concept that we need to clarify. So Newman he has spent half of his life in Oxford among educated people, and he knew that educated people are not necessarily the best part of society. They're not. Therefore, he objects and he opposes the idea that education is a way to improve the moral tone of society, and particularly was opposing those projects promoted by Sir Peel or Lord Macaulay that wanted education to replace religion in the formation of public morality. So in his writing, he stressed a few times the fact that morality and knowledge are two separate parts, and I've selected a few quotes. There's quote number 10 is my favorite one. It's quite long, so you might read it on your own, where he clearly stresses the difference between education and morality. Now, he says the direct end of education, again, is intellectual improvement. But he doesn't exclude or he doesn't deny that education might have indirect consequences, positive consequences on the character of the person. So it might be used to improve the moral character of the student, and this is what the church does, according to Newman, in a Catholic university. So the university is not only for the intellectual improvement, but also for the formation of the character. But we need to remember that, again, the ultimate end is knowledge, is not morality, and secondly, that knowledge doesn't make people better. What are the possible positive consequences of education on the moral character? Well, Newman says, when we occupy our mind with noble objects, we tend to expel the excitements of senses, and we refine our mind, we cultivate our feelings, and education is also a form of asceticism. It's a form of self-control. It's a way of spending time on a purpose. So it might be useful for the character, but it's not a way of salvation. When Newman establishes a university here in Ireland, he wanted a double system based not only on the frontal class lesson, but also based on the common life within colleges. So he divided the students in different colleges. Initially, he wanted students from different areas of the world divided into different national colleges, but this never happened. In any case, he thought that the tutor had a very important role, especially in the development of the character. And once again, this is how, according to Newman, a Catholic university should be organized. Newman says when people live together, there's an ethos, and they tend to have a common mind. And this common mind becomes as a way of living for them. He had experienced this in Oxford. He had tried to improve and implement this double model in his times in Oxford, but he had some problems in the college where he was a fellow in another college. Now, how do we end this story of the Catholic University of Ireland? As I said before, the university never got a charter, which is a formal approval from the state. So basically, its degrees were not valid. Moreover, there were divisions among the bishops, and Newman, in his letters, complains about the lack of help from the Bishop of Dublin, which was Paul Cullen. Now, nowadays we know that this was a explicit strategy that Cullen had in order to kind of appear on the background and not show to the other bishops that he was the man behind the university. But in Newman's time, Newman perceived this as a form of a lack of intervention by the bishop. Moreover, as I said before, Newman spent time traveling and spent time in Birmingham. There was no middle class providing enough students for the university. Moreover, Newman envisaged to involve students from every English-speaking country and maybe from other countries. But in 1852 and 54, I think, in both Oxford and Cambridge, the restriction to Catholics were lifted. So they abolished some of the religious tests. So English Catholic could go to Cambridge and Oxford rather than come into Dublin. So Dublin was never able to attract foreign students. So eventually this university lost students. For a period it was run by the dioceses. Then in 1882 the Jesuits took it, but they couldn't run according to the Jesuit tradition. So it was more a place to prepare students for examinations. And eventually it was one of the founding colleges of the National University of Ireland. So eventually the state took it. And from what I know, the Catholic University of Ireland is still alive, even if it doesn't exist in reality, but this was never formally abolished. So I think, the Bishop of Dublin is the Chancellor, and it exists in some files in the Archbishop diocese. Well, I'm not joking, but when the centenary was celebrated in 1952, the bishop was there as a chancellor. So he was still acting as a... So this is the sad story of the Catholic University of Ireland. But as I said before, it's even if Newman's project in Ireland didn't succeed, at least as he wanted, still today we read his writings related to the university, to the foundation of this university. And these writings are relevant not only for Catholics, but for anyone who wants to have an idea of what a university should be. And Newman was aware that he clearly says at the beginning of the idea of a university that he was treating the subject from a philosophical point of view. So he was writing not from a confessional point of view, but for anyone who wants to reflect. And this is, I think, why today, after 100 years, we are still reading and learning from Newman. Thanks.